All right, welcome everyone. Nice to see you all today. And my name is Almaz Zelleke. I'm sharing the session. We have 3 presentations in the session, not 4. We have a little bit of an effort on each of our presenters, which is great. We're going to start with From Theory to Practice, Embedding Feminist Principles in UBI Implementation. This is a joint paper by Clem Davies at the University of Freiburg, Maria Franchi from the University of Bath, and Chloe Halpany from Queen's University. And Maria and Chloe, who are here today, are going to be doing the presentation together. So go ahead.
Do we sit here? Or do we
You can sit back.
Oh, okay, good. How do we make the slides go?
Yeah.
Not on the they're not supposed to be on the screen.
Maybe you can also go there.
I think
As a
we have
mic
the
there.
slides for the first one.
That's the
second one. No, not that's the second one. First one is
I think the pictures aren't going to work in that one, but that's okay.
Yeah.
We'll just
We'll just go with it, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
That's a good start.
Yeah, it's hard to say.
Okay, so I go. Thank you for coming to this presentation. It's really nice to see so many people in here. We'll just introduce ourselves first. My name's Maria Franchi. I'm a PhD student at the University of Bath, and I'm attached to the Work-Free project. So I'm here. And I'm really a sociologist.
Yeah, my name is Chloe Halpany. I'm a PhD student at the School of Kinesiology and Health Studies at Queen's University in Canada. I'm not a kinesiologist, kind of fall more in the realm of sociology as well. I just ended up there kind of by accident, but a happy accident. And we're not joined today, sadly, by our colleague Clem, who's a PhD student at Davies in Freiburg in Germany, and she's an economist with her background. So that's sort of the 3 PhD students who've been working together on this over the past couple of months.
Brilliant, thank you. Okay, so we wanted to demonstrate through an intersectional feminist approach that there's a traditional model that amongst theorists and practitioners that UBI alone will act as a catalyst for transformative change, not only in the economic, but social, cultural, environmental and political spheres. And this assumption neglects the high context dependency of UBI in application. And our reviews of existing feminist literature predict radically different outcomes, from permanent entrenchment within unpaid domestic roles for women and to the realignment of the economy to a post-growth universal caretaker paradigm. So to date, the gender-neutral approaches in both empirical and conceptual research have failed to meaningfully take account of or address structural forms of injustice occurring along intersecting axes of power and oppression. And so I wanted to give an example of this, that I live in the UK. If I received a basic income and I was in an abusive relationship, the money would really enable me to leave that relationship because the social cultural context I live in would be supportive of me leaving that relationship. But in India, where Work-Free is based, I've worked with women who are experiencing domestic violence and abuse, who have the basic income and other assets, but the social cultural context they're in means that just the money alone isn't enough for them to leave, because they would experience a social death. They would have to cut ties with everybody and everyone would be against them for doing it. So that's the sort of social, cultural, environmental, political context we need to take into account. So we wanted to ask to what extent are the considerations of intersectional equity incorporated into the design of basic income pilot programs, and what's the significance and implications of that? So we brought together 4 areas really of thinking. I'm just going to have to do this. So first of all, our concern, therefore, is that a gender-neutral economic intervention will fail to impact on those social, cultural, environmental, and political conditions if it fails to consider the wider intersectional inequalities that underpin, generate, and replicate inequality and are specific to time and place. So a feminist perspective aspires to a transformative policy rather than a technical intervention, and illuminates as a leap of faith the possibility that more money alone will imply more equity. Fraser suggests that a basic income should contain the 7 principles of gender equity that she identifies. They are anti-exploitation, income equality, leisure time equality, equality of respect, anti-marginalisation, and anti-androcentrism. Her critique, alongside these principles, highlights the paucity of the assumption that the economic has primacy and in turn will impact on the social, cultural, environmental, and political context. I'm just going to say SCEP from now on, because that's too much of a mouthful. But also gives us a starting point for exploring what else needs to be considered. So that brings us to the question of what additional action in the design and implementation of the basic income would better attempt to recognise and take account of these differences, both in the initial context and the final results of the intervention. Some basic income pilots have included a plus, for example, in terms of mitigating interactions between the BI and other state provision and services, and in terms of collective bargaining and empowerment support. Work-free is a pilot whose thesis is that whilst the money may provide time, it requires a participatory plus to create space for the SCEP change. We've thought about what the key purpose of pilots are: to build evidence about the impacts of a particular policy and to test design. So research approaches tend to look for control of variables, and we think the complexity of intersectional inequalities in a specific SCEP context creates a challenge that we want to address. We've identified an overlap between the gender equity and the SCEP contained both in feminist methodology and intersectional inclusion. And we wanted to explore how the design of pilots and policy could take account of this complex set of relations. Our feminist lens leads us to an interrogation of objectification and problematization within pilot design that can obscure intersectionality as it's experienced and therefore differential impacts. We've drawn on the widespread use of EDI impact and policy frameworks, which attempt to gauge the potential differential impacts of any given policy in the planning stages in order to mitigate them. So we've used a number of these as our starting point, and we've considered ways in which this approach might aid the design of basic income policy across different SCEP contexts in a way that might provide for more equity.
Just wanted to check if the online people are able to follow the volume. We have 6 people online.
I think they listen well.
Okay, fine. Sorry, please go ahead.
No, thanks. It's a good question. So Maria had the hard part, and basically I'm here to sort of try to sum up that, which basically what we're proposing here is that contextual, so those SCEP factors, social, cultural, environmental, political, and intersectional factors are highly relevant to the design of basic income pilots. If we are assuming that pilots are an important mechanism for generating evidence and building public support for basic income, then these things are also things that need to be taken into consideration when we're thinking about basic income pilots. And also that a tailored framework that makes visible and engages with these issues might be a valuable tool to inform the design of a more gender just and transformative basic income pilot, and therefore hopefully potentially policy. So really, as an overview of all of the things that Maria shared, what we did is drew up a draft framework, which we'll touch on in a moment, and used it to explore 3 different pilot projects. We chose pilots for which we had public access to enough information that there was adequate documentation online to be able to actually get a sense of where policymakers or pilot designers' heads were at when they were thinking about these pilots. We did not have access to internal documents or data. We didn't necessarily want access to that because we wanted to know what was publicly facing, what was made publicly available. We chose things that were geographically widespread in very different contexts, and that represented different funding models. We've got a mix of public and private and thematic interests. So it's a very limited sample. We're only looking at 3 cases right now, but really wanted to get a sense of whether the questions that we were asking were the right ones, what kinds of insights they revealed, and how we might be able to use this moving forward, potentially looking at more pilots. So the questions that we were asking, so to guide our analysis, we developed a framework of guiding questions to examine what, how, why, and with what effects contextual justice and gender-focused and intersectional issues are taken up in documentation related to basic income pilot design. So we started from 2 existing policy analysis frameworks. One is Kannenberg et al.'s revised version of McPhail's feminist policy analysis framework, and another is Kankowski et al.'s intersectionality based policy analysis. But really, both of these are frameworks that have been explicitly developed to analyze public policy through an intersectional feminist lens and really make visible some of these issues of gender-based and other forms of inequity. Beginning with the questions we laid out here as a starting point, we went through a collaborative process of synthesizing, revising, removing, and in some cases adding questions based on our own knowledge and expertise in this area, and to be more directly applicable to the context of pilots, for instance. So these frameworks that we were using to build on were more looking at permanently developed public policy versus something that is inherently more temporary. So what's laid out on this slide here outlines some abbreviated versions of the full questions we used, but really gives an overview of the types of things we were interested in when reviewing our sources from these 3 pilots. So for instance, we've got up in the left-hand corner, problem definition. What problem or problems does the pilot purport to respond to? Which does it not purport to respond to? And how are these framed? Another example, which is on the bottom left, engagement and consultation. How has engagement, for instance, with communities, particularly equity-deserving communities, been integrated into the pilot's design? Who is or is not involved? And another one that I'll just highlight here is power and intersectionality, which is right to the right of engagement and consultation. Are intersecting systems of oppression acknowledged or considered, and if so, how? These are, again, shorter versions of the full questions that we use, but gives a sort of taste of what types of things we were looking at when we were engaging with these documents. Once we finalized these questions, our team reviewed documentation related to the 3 pilots we chose, which you'll hear about in a moment, and took notes related to these series of questions as a way to structure our analysis. In this way, our aim was to generate insights on the case studies we were analyzing, but also to explore the utility of this sort of framework or approach as a tool for pilot development, implementation, or evaluation. So with that overview, we'll turn to a quick summary of some of what we found for the cases we looked at, starting with a pilot in Germany. Got a different slide deck here, so our pictures sadly aren't working. It's not normally a block there. And I'm reading this for Clem, so I'm going to not try to pronounce anything in German for everybody's benefit. But she was looking at a case study in Germany. I will try Grünsteinkommen. I don't think that was great, but it was a crowdfunded experiment. It is a crowdfunded experiment running for 3 years from 2021 to 2024 with 120 each receiving 1,200 euros a month. The crowdfunded experiment was intended to limit the influence of political cycles, so it is private. Recipients are people who are between the ages of 21 and 40 in single-person households, who are registered, residing in Germany, and who are earning a middle-class income, which is interesting. The single-person household also was it sort of overlooked the chance to look at a basic income's effect on care work. So they're intentionally limiting it or scoping it to single people who did not have any dependents. So really limiting the ability to look at basic income, how it shapes care work, reproductive labor, and other unpaid labor. And obviously the focus on the middle class is an interesting one. And in terms of measuring success, the framing of the project was really focused on quality of life changes and knowing and testing how an unconditionally guaranteed income leads to fundamental changes in the context of health, work, digital revolution, cohesion, politics, and consumption. There was no mention in policy documents of poverty alleviation, with the argument that Germany already has an established welfare state to meet these basic needs. And really that focus, sort of, if you're thinking of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, was at the top, and really focusing on those people who are in the middle class. If we move to Namibia, we're not moving to Ontario, we're moving to Namibia, so I'll hand it back to you. Different side.
Yeah, so the Namibia pilot was part of a campaign to introduce a nationwide basic income. And so it was intended to demonstrate the beneficial impact. They chose a particularly impoverished area for saturation sample, and the recipients also suffered from barriers to access to HIV medical assistance. And the study identified an increase in small businesses, including by women, and an increase in access to those HIV services. What I thought was interesting was that the demographic identifies gender, age, cultural and language differences, but doesn't take any account of differential impacts or barriers based on them. The community engagement wasn't built in, but interestingly, the community itself set up a committee, and the project managers were bright enough, I suppose, to include that and to involve them. So they adapted to that, and then there was part of community engagement. And the HIV health issues were key to problematization, but again, not differentiated in other ways. So there wasn't really any intersectional understanding about access to HIV services.
And finally, now we'll go to Ontario, and I'll go quite quickly because you're going to hear more about Ontario in a couple of minutes from me more. But in Ontario, the basic income pilot that ran there from 2018 to 2019, which was prematurely canceled, and then you probably know about that. It was an income tested pilot and was explicitly framed as a poverty reduction measure. And one of the main things that was really interesting reviewing documentation related to the Ontario pilot was that despite sort of these ongoing efforts to really frame it as a poverty alleviation experiment, there's really limited engagement with who is more likely to be poor, which in Canada is Indigenous people, single parents, especially single mothers, disabled people, newcomers, refugees, and why those people are made to be poor in the first place. And a lot of sort of really indirect language around vulnerable workers and like access, who is working precariously and who is living in poverty without recognition of who those people are and who is responsible for making them that way. So I'll skim that over quickly, but it was an interesting thing that came up. I'll pass it back to Maria to close us off.
Okay, so really good. So a very small amount of data was looked at, but really the two important factors underlying our analysis, one, that UBI is not a neutral policy, and secondly, on the significance and importance of pilots, and the conclusions they allow to be drawn for the broader basic income debate. So we strongly feel that this isn't a nice to have part of a policy. We've aimed to show that the SCEP context and the intersectional feminist approach is essential to delivering a transformative programme, but it's often treated as nice to have. And when choices are made, simplicity, budget constraints, or scientific restrictions, these are the kind of first things to be dropped. And what else am I going to say? Secondly, it's not neutral. Positive or neutral impact is not a guaranteed impact result, and that risks being a technical intervention that could exacerbate inequalities if we don't take this into account, and certainly not necessarily a transformative intervention. And thirdly, that pilots and policy don't operate in a vacuum. They all have context, and that context is the key factor in transformative potential. So we felt that our framework draws attention, but it doesn't provide for the addition of significant pluses, not pulses. So things like coaching and advice around interactions with the state before and after the pilot, collective participatory space in relation to the pilot to maximise impact and maximise step change. We felt that our framework identifies the need and makes visible these issues, but it doesn't provide an answer to them. But we do feel that this feminist methodology, which can really include and privilege local experiential knowledge, is really important to understanding the experience of people receiving basic income and the change that is possible for them. So, in conclusion, we don't think it's as simple as it looks, and the real world is complicated, and we need to find a way that is practicable to include that complexity and complication. We're proposing applying this framework to athletics in depth, and we want to investigate how improvements can be made to UBI, but also welfare policy and programs in general. So anything you want to add to the conclusions?
Nothing to add.
All right, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Wonderful. Next, we have Chloe again. Chloe's going to speak in this paper on the we need to take care of each other, and that's what this program was helping to do. Disabled women's experiences in the Ontario basic income pilot. So really following on the framework that you've identified in the first paper.
Yeah, basically, you know, again.
Okay, so make sure we have the right slide deck up. Yes.
Amazing. Okay. Sorry that you have to hear from me twice in a row. Not your lucky day, but yeah, I'm going to be sharing a little bit more about the experiences of disabled women in the Ontario Basic Income Pilot, looking at basic income through a feminist disability lens. This paper has been accepted in the Canadian Journal of Disability Studies and will be published this fall, open access, which is exciting. But yeah, I'm a first year PhD, or now second year PhD student at Queen's, and involved in basic income advocacy as well. I've been around for a couple of years and chatting about the Ontario Basic Income Pilot, but really excited to share this, which was sort of a paper that I was able to flesh out in the first year of my doctoral work through a disability studies course. So yeah. Start off with a little bit about the policy and literature context, and then move on to research questions and methods, talking a little bit more about findings and the experiences of women before, during, and after basic income, and then move to discussion and implications. But let's just first start by setting the stage, which many of you are probably quite familiar with already, but in early 2018, the Ontario Basic Income Pilot, or OBIP, was launched by the former Liberal provincial government. The pilot, which was designed more in line with the negative income tax experiment, it was income tested and provided over 4,000 Ontario residents with a guaranteed annual income, and disabled participants received an additional monthly top-up of up to $500 or $6,000 annually. The pilot was prematurely canceled in July of 2018 following a change of government. While there's a large body of conceptual and empirical work focused on basic income in theory and practice, with many of you here contributing to that body of literature, disability has not received a lot of attention in this work. There are definitely exceptions to that, but it has not been a huge focus. Although there is a small but very compelling and complementary body of existing scholarship that focuses on existing welfare or social assistance programs through a disability lens. Among those, the Ontario Disability Support Program, or ODSP, which is the main program in Ontario where this pilot takes place that provides income support to disabled low-income individuals, which many folks who were receiving money as part of the Ontario pilot will previously access it. So this is important context, which we'll come to, but this body of work really highlights the punitive and inadequate nature of these and similar programs, particularly for marginalized and disabled individuals. So with this in mind, the questions I was interested in exploring here surrounded the relationship between disability and the receipt of targeted income assistance programs, including how ableism is produced, sustained, or challenged through these programs, as well as what about a basic income, if anything, would interrupt or subvert these trends. In other words, while this is a presentation about basic income and the Ontario pilot, it's also about poverty and policy responses to it more generally. To explore this question, I went back to my interview data and threw on a subsample of transcripts with 15 women who were enrolled in the Ontario Basic Income Pilot and who self-identified as disabled, had experiences with impairment, or who had previously accessed disability-targeted income support programs such as ODSP. Methodologically and theoretically, this is informed by narrative inquiry, critical disability, and more specifically, feminist disability scholarship. And without getting into too much detail, what this really translates to for me is a commitment to retrieving and amplifying the voices of women who are facing systemic oppression and attending to the day-to-day experiences of disablement, while also contextualizing these within broader systems of power and domination. So I also come to this work as someone with lived and living experience of neurodivergence and mental illness, and without firsthand experience of poverty, and also who is very actively engaged in activism related to basic income. So I'm not a neutral presenter by any means. So narrative methods led me to organize my findings temporally. So I'll be briefly highlighting some of the key findings that emerged through women's stories about their lives before, during, and after the Ontario Basic Income Pilot. And I began every interview by asking women about their lives before basic income. So long prior to their receipt of basic income, the woman I spoke to had been navigating a reality where disability and poverty were deeply intertwined. Becoming disabled often meant becoming poor. So this quote at the top saying, I started to feel unwell and I got sicker and sicker. I was declared officially disabled. I did a cash flow statement and realized because of my disability and the number of hours I could actually work, I would never escape poverty. For others, impairment was an unavoidable consequence of living in poverty. So this quote at the bottom, I think, is quite illustrative of the ways in which multiple systems of power and domination collide in some pretty sinister ways at the intersection of class, gender, and ability. So one of these factors contributing to my experience of poverty is 100% the fact that I'm a woman and the fact that I'm also a survivor of sexual assault, and I consequently have post-traumatic stress disorder and numerous mental health issues around that affect my ability to work. So in this context, most women I spoke with described understanding or coming to terms with disability, not organically, but because they had to identify as such in order to access supports and care that they needed to survive. For almost everybody I spoke with, this meant that in their lives prior to the Ontario Basic Income Pilot, they had sought support through the Ontario Disability Support Program, or ODSP. This is not a great program for those who are not familiar with it. When you think of pretty traditional stereotypes of what welfare is in terms of being very low and highly conditional and very stigmatizing and dehumanizing, this is what came out here again. Women widely describe the process of applying to ODSP as requiring significant time and emotional labor. Disability became a contested terrain where medical professionals and caseworkers held the ultimate power to decide who was disabled enough to deserve assistance. So this quote saying, when I originally applied for ODSP, it was like sitting in front of a warden. They go into such in-depth personal information, which they don't need. It was degrading. I swear my medical file was at least 3 to 4 inches wide. That said, women's struggles almost always persisted even after they had been accepted to the program. Saying, I think women's are the ones that get the brunt of it. You're lazy, you have kids, you're staying home. I remember when I went on ODSP, it was always critical of me. The single mother thing is a hard thing to pull off. Let's put it that way. While there were examples of resistance in women's narratives, and I'll touch on these later, it's really hard to deny the prominence of struggle in women's stories about their lives prior to the Ontario pilot. And that was the context for many women when they first heard about a new project that was coming to their community. So women's lives before the Ontario pilot played a really important role in framing and contextualizing their experiences during it, which is why I spent time sharing that to start. All but one woman I had spoke with had previously been receiving ODSP, and all perceived basic income to be everything that ODSP was not: a stable, reliable, unconditional, and more dignified source of income. So, quote, for the first time in 20 years, I didn't have to answer to anybody about how to spend it. I didn't have to justify surviving. And that was a huge relief and a huge change. Women also spoke to the impact of receiving a monthly income that for many was far higher than they were accustomed to. I say this cautiously, given that the pilot brought disabled participants only just above the poverty line, which I think should probably raise some other questions about what we think is adequate and for who and why. And yet, relative income security was a major theme characterizing women's lives throughout the pilot. And you see there just the monthly maximum difference between ODSP and the Ontario pilot, which was about an $800 Canadian per. Another common element of women's narratives was the relationship between poverty, stress, and debility and impairment, with many pointing to the ways in which basic income improved their health and well-being. So, quote, I have fibromyalgia and it feeds on stress. The worse my stress gets, the worse my pain gets, the worse my sleep gets, the worse my fatigue gets, the worse everything gets. So not having to worry about money constantly ease my stress level. I think this and other quotes help us strengthen our understanding of poverty as disabling, socially, but also biologically. While these narratives may feel like they sit uneasily with some of the core ideas and tenets of certain strands of disability scholarship, especially those which are very critical of peer-focused narratives, I think an alternative and perhaps more generous interpretation is one that acknowledges that the disproportionate exposure to debility, impairment, and disability-based oppression on the basis of income or class is both avoidable and unjust. At the same time, women also told stories about the way that basic income provided the material stability to resist compulsory able-bodiedness and mindedness and be more unapologetically, or at the very least more comfortably, sick or disabled. For some, basic income offered the opportunity to engage in paid work that was more meaningful and accessible on a personal level. So, quote, I make my own hours, which means when I'm not well, I don't work, and when I am well, I do work. I have workshops and I run them, but most of the time they're from home. So if I have a flare-up, I can always excuse myself and I'm still in my own home. For others, the material stability meant that they could afford to withdraw from the labor market altogether, engage in community work that aligns with their passions and interests, such as volunteering in a community garden or care for sick relatives or a neighbor in crisis. I'd suggest that these narratives gesture towards the catalyzing potential of more generous income support programs and cultivating the material foundation to support greater collective care and interdependence. At the same time, it's important to highlight that while women's narratives about their lives during the pilot were overwhelmingly positive, there are some counterpoints that I think are worth mentioning here. The first is that while participants did widely describe OBIP as less invasive than ODSP in terms of the application process, it's actually unclear that the pilot really differed substantially from ODSP in terms of how disability was proven to determine initial eligibility. So that sort of initial how you have to prove yourself to being disabled to receive that additional support, unclear whether that was actually any different on the pilot. And more generally, women's accounts revealed mixed opinions about whether the pilot and ODSP were substantively different. So really good, a long quote, but a really good quote. It was just as hard on the pilot as it was in ODSP, just different comments. If you're on ODSP, it's, oh, you're faking, you can work, automatically thinking that you're not disabled unless you're in a wheelchair or missing both limbs. With basic income, it was, oh, money for nothing. Others saying, oh yeah, the beer store will be busy, the crackheads are going to be happy this week. The words change, but the intent and what's behind them is the same. There's a lot to unpack in this quote that I don't have time for in my time today, but I think the logic that this person identifies and how it is embedded within our social policy and transfer programs is really important to interrogate and something that I hope to be able to look at more moving forward. That said, for most women, the pilot's biggest downfall was undoubtedly its cruel and unexpected demise, and this informed how they spoke about their lives after basic income. Former Minister of Children, Community and Social Services, Lisa McLeod, announced the termination of the Ontario pilot in July of 2018, less than 16 months into its expected 3-year tenure. Although women had begun to courageously author hopeful and optimistic stories about what their lives would look like post-pilot, the cancellation fundamentally changed this and itself had really debilitating and disabling effects. Most anticipated that their lives would soon be met with uncertainty, anxiety, and a deep sense of loss, largely because people knew that what they were about to be re-exposed to were the same harms that they had had a temporary reprieve from. So, quote, I had to go submit 25 pieces of documentation to get back onto ODSP. I got out of the office and into the parking lot and burst into tears. I realized that all of a sudden I didn't feel like the same person that I was yesterday. There's a lot about the basic income pilot that I think appropriately lends itself to anger and frustration and sadness. And it's something that I struggle with ethically, and how to represent these stories without it just being negative, harm. And so I think we can and arguably must also read hope within these narratives. So I'll pause here to read 2 quotes from 2 different interviews that I think are very much characterized by resistance to neoliberal and capitalist norms within social policy. So the first quote, it's really nice to hear Doug the Slug, that was our Premier Doug Ford, tell me that the best social program is a job, but where would he like me to get one at my age and my health in Thunder Bay, just an isolated city in Northern Ontario? I've always believed that I earn my pay, even if it's just ODSP. I don't sit at home, and if I do, I'm not well. And even when I'm home and doing something, I think you would find that the majority of people who live or try very hard to live on a disability income are the same way. And the second quote, I'm highly conscious of people's belief that I should feel empowered from working and how work is supposed to give me more dignity. But the question that runs through my head when I hear all of this is, when do I get to take care of myself and do what's best for me? When do I get to not be so exhausted that I fall asleep without making dinner, or not be able to take care of my home and I'm too embarrassed to have people over? That's quite literally, even with basic income, what happens to me, because working takes energy. The concept that work is the be-all end-all for a person with a disability is wrong. Disability and poverty have featured very prominently in recent policy debates in Canada. And in light of this, I contend that the accounts featured throughout this study offer essential insights on topics that have not received a lot of attention in policy, academic, and advocacy settings. In addition to exposing the inextricable relationship between poverty and disability, women's accounts lay bare the ableist underpinnings of ODSP as a program that forces women to claim and prove disability in an oppressive environment where the labels of disabled and welfare recipient continue to bear social, political, and economic consequences. In this context, disabled women's receipt of a mostly guaranteed, less conditional, and more adequate income meant that women could afford basic needs, participate meaningfully in society, and more comfortably manage the effects of illness or impairment. In other words, basic income helped disabled women survive in an ableist world. Beyond this, women's accounts of their lives, both during and after the pilot, offer a glimpse into basic income's potential in building a stronger foundation for disabled people to practice collective care, resist dominant discourses of power, and dream up different disability futures. Ultimately, I think the broader significance of this work is its insistence that income support programs, including basic income, be understood as sites of struggle and uncertainty in which ableism and interlocking forms of oppression can either be challenged or reproduced. These stories hint at what might emerge when we challenge granted ways of thinking and doing and open the door to new possibilities. What if we designed income support programs that no longer cruelly held disabled and non-disabled people below the poverty line? What would a society look like that valued people regardless of their productive potential? And what would it mean for policy to be evaluated not by employment and health outcomes, but by whether it supports a disabled mother to enjoy a picnic in the park with her children? So with that, I will wrap up and happy to chat more later on.
Really important information about that pilot. All right, our final presentation is from Leticia Morales from Universidad Austral de Chile, gender trade-offs in basic income regimes.
Thank you, Almaz. Thank you, everybody, for being here. It's very nice to see a full room in this session. And I would like to start introducing myself. I'm Leticia Morales from Universidad Austral de Chile. I'm a legal scholar at law school in the south of Chile, in Valdivia. I would like to start showing these two pictures that they are here. That the first one shows the performance of last thesis. Maybe some of you are familiar with this group of women that they did a public space performance, and they are called in Spanish las tesis. And it was part of the protest that happened in Chile in October 2019, in the period that it was called Estallido Social, the social revolution. And then they were replicated in other countries, this performance. And in the second picture is the last thesis senior that they came after, and there's again a group of women, but with older women. So the idea of starting with these two pictures is to show some of the things I would like to talk about. That is the diversity that they are in the category of women. So it's very sensitive mouse. Right, but The main research on basic income from a gender perspective has been for already many years, more than 20 years, discussing and showing that there are several concerns, and part of those concerns are regarding, is basic income good for women? Is basic income good for reducing unequal treatment of women in the labor market, or in parallel, is basic income good to reduce gender violence and promote women's standing inside the family or outside the family? So to this question has been a strong, or mostly a strongly yes answer, or prone to say yes, basic income is good for women because it helps to increase well-being, autonomy, equal opportunities, the political participation, and some women have a study, among other effects or positive effects. And that is part of what in this project we call external approach. So an approach that is seeing what are the positive or negative effects, but mostly has been discussed positive effects for women as a whole. So this external approach shows that women as a group of as a category are pitched against men as a group of a category, and that's mostly what are the research in the field, a part of what we just heard. So that's a very, very interesting discussion for me too, because it seems that we are in a similar line of thinking with the previous person. So, so we want to, as part of the discussion, move from this external approach and start thinking and analyzing for what we call the internal approach. That internal approach want to show or want to discuss and analyze what we call women-women trade-off. And that is an examination of tensions internal to women as a group or internal to women as a category, and the different diverse activities and group of different women that they are in this broad category. And for that, we, as a minimum, want to show that at least there are three tensions or trade-offs that regards what we call horizontal tensions, vertical tensions, and temporal tensions. So I'm going to just show some of these tensions and trade-offs briefly. with some of the examples that they are in the literature. So first of all, the horizontal tensions shows or want to show that there are trade-off different spheres of activities that women have an interest in. Let's think, for instance, the labor market versus family, focusing on unpaid work and care labor. If we see the Finnish experiment, part of what has been examined and analyzed in one of the papers, the one that examined and studied the data from the Finnish experiment by Oli Kangas and Nina Chikan. Now, I think I haven't pronounced properly. But it's Finnish scholars from a study from 2023. They are focused on unemployed women, and what they want, one of the conclusions is that there is strong evidence that the cash for care from care allowance typically used in Finnish families with small children reduces female employment in both the short and long term. So that's the tensions that we are seeing here is there are, of course, inside the category of women, then is the need of focusing or need for basic income to try to have effects in young women versus what activities can select other women that they have different interests or activities, or like interest of forming a family or interest on going into the labor market. So it's for that reason there are the horizontal tension. So moving on to the second category of tensions, that's the vertical tensions. I think that here there are trade-offs because women are each of different situations in a vertical, of course, direction. For instance, worse off against better off women. Well, one example of this situation that we are examining is the cases of different levels of education. So we can find non-educated women versus educated women, and basic income can do different or can have different effects depending on what are these different categories, and therefore have different impacts in citizenship and political participation. Other way of seeing this also, this vertical tensions, is if we examine poor women against wealthier women and the interest they might have in each of these smaller groups. Like, for instance, when we think about poorer women, we think basic income will be a important tool to address the informal work or to have a minimum floor for them to have have a decent life. While the worries and the problems that they are examining from other scholars thinking of basic income effects for women are thinking more in changing the structural ways of inside their life. No? They're thinking of how to change social structures and norms where they are embedded the domination or oppression inside, for instance, families or parenting practices. And finally, temporal tensions are the third group that we identify. Maybe more, and it will be nice or interesting to discuss about that. But we are thinking trade-off here of positive impact in one part of the life cycle against another. And here, I would like to bring back the discussion that was held yesterday regarding a book that was presented and discussed by several members of the Korean, the authors are Korean and several members of this conference, A Feasible Basic Income Plan in Korea. And this book has some of it was discussed some of the effects that I would like to mention here. That is, for instance, basic income as a tool that helps marriage reproductive bonus, like this idea of that basic income is needed for pro-natal policies, and that as such means that we are teaching sexual and reproductive freedom in early life against other type of, for instance, stable social security later in life. So we have here again tensions that they are inside what is basic income good for in different stages of life cycle. So the approach of this project is not about teaching internal against external way of analysis, but thinking and stressing the importance of the need of an additional analysis that is obscured by the focus, systematically focusing on the external tension. And I think that's part of the work that has been done by Maria and Chloe. If that is correct, so what we need is disaggregated data and information inside the women as a category. We need also to identify and take into consideration different needs, different interests, and of course, different impacts that basic income has in women's life. So the aim that I think basic income works in different fields will be looking for is a scenario where a social policy protects women and promotes their interests, their needs, and of course, well-being, autonomy, and equal protection. That is where we started. The best as possible, considering all the different dimensions. So where does basic income fit in this broad picture? And here we can think of different positions or approaches and give up on basic income since the first one that it might come to the mind of some, but of course we are not interested in giving up on basic income, but at least a big part of the work is seeing what basic income can do for women. So that's not this position that we are going to take on. But the other two are more interesting. The second, defending complementary social policies about basic income and policy changes, is something that has been discussed from the first day, and that is part of the proposal, basic income with other policies, social policies. But then again, it needs to be a careful examination of what policies and what they are doing to address the different problems or situations. And finally, in line with what Maria and Chloe were saying, designing a basic income policy that can answer the different challenges that it has been examined previously. So as a way of conclusions, I will start remembering that we start from the point of the external perspective approach of basic income is insufficient. Secondly, then move to the thesis that the analysis from internal approach or perspectives is with the focus in women's horizontal, vertical, and temporal trade-off, shows that basic income is not a neutral policy, and something that it was said before, and I swear that we haven't been communicating before, but seems that we are in the same line of thinking. And finally, that has implications or consequences that basic income has limits in doing justice to women as a category, and this is important to start to look at this disaggregated data. And finally, they need to be aware that there is no neutrality on the designs of basic income. And with that, I thank you for the attention.
Thank you to all three of our presenters today. I am old enough that I can remember when we first started talking about gender in basic income conferences. It was this kind of binary question: is basic income good for women or bad for women? And it's really wonderful to see how far we've advanced in thinking about not just whether basic income is good or bad for women, but using that feminist, gender inclusive perspective to analyze ways in which different kinds of design, different basic income designs can be better or worse for different groups of women. And then that perspective also giving rise to analysis about how basic income design can affect different groups of people more broadly, including disability, race, ethnic origin, and so on within communities. So thank you all again for doing that and for showing us the ways to how that can be done very practically. Thank you. And thank you also to keeping the time. So we now have about 20 minutes for discussion. I'd like to especially invite our online participants to ask a question. And I hope you'll let me know if there is a question from the online audience, but also opening it up to our in-person audience here. So let's take maybe 3 or 4 questions at a time, and so keep notes on what the questions are, and then give every presenter a chance to answer those questions, and then if we have time, we'll take another round. Okay, so I see a question in the back, and you can just go ahead and speak without a microphone.
Yeah, so I really appreciate this. We had asked previously to other speakers about our pilot that we're doing for single moms. My specific question is, do you think there's particular sensitivities or preparations that we should do for this group? How do we make sure that this is done in an ethical way? That's something that I've really taken a lot of time and engaging with community stakeholders and social workers on this issue. So what are the steps for preparation and engaging with this particular community that you think protects them, and also make sure that our engagement with them is effective and also helpful for and there's no power imbalance in that relationship?
Okay, Tyler, you're talking about a pilot in Taiwan.
Yes.
Correct. Thank you. Philly.
Yeah, thank you very much for the 3 presentations. I have a question related to these vertical tension. In particular, I would like to know whether you think that the vertical tensions, there are good reasons to believe that the vertical tensions will be stronger among women than among men. So among men, you can expect to have vertical tensions in the sense that people who are have a high income will be net contributors to any basic income of any ambition, and the people who will benefit from it by having wider options, whatever they do with that basic income, will be people at the bottom. So there is a tension between, say, the richer people and the poorer people. And the question is whether this applies more strongly for women for the following reason. I'll just give an example. There was this very strong negative reaction to basic income by a woman who was the Minister for Social Policy in Italy, called Elsa Fornero, and also a professor of economics. And she said, if the basic income is introduced, I know the Italians that spend that time enjoying the sun on the beach and eating pasta. And of course, that's not what Italians would do. In particular, what would be the real impact? Would Elsa Fornero herself change the way of a relationship to a job? No, she would keep working. She has an interesting job. Even if the basic income was 3,000 euros per month, she would still be doing her job. What difference would it make for a cleaner? A cleaner will say, oh, with a basic income, even 800 euros, I'll work less. No? And therefore, I'll go and pick up my kids at school at 4 instead of working until 7 in Mrs. Fornero's house or in her office. As a result of which, Mrs. Fornero will not only be taxed in order to fund the basic income for everyone. But also, she'll have to pay more for a cleaner in order to get a cleaner until 7 o'clock. And possibly it will be so expensive because of that she'll have to do some of the work herself, which she'll have to do, not her husband. So my question to you is, and for that reason, and because of these communicating channels between also income participation in the workforce, different for the people with a better job and a worse job, and then the sharing of household tasks, isn't there a good reason to believe that the vertical tension, and I find your distinction very interesting there with these three categories, that the vertical tensions will be stronger among women than among men, and therefore, hence also the heat of the basic income debate in feminist circles.
Are there any women who'd like to ask a question in this panel? I thought there were. Okay.
Yeah, so I'm interested in an activist incremental approach to reforming the welfare system. Like there's lots of different aspects of the welfare and the tax system that have elements of basic income that's very far away. So like people are not treated on an individual basis. It's insufficient. There's all these categories of the ideal typical basic income that interrelate with feminist thinking and also with the system. And so like most of our politicians in Australia, they would not support a basic income, but we've got quite a feminist federal government at the moment. So it's possible that there is like welfare reform that could lead in the direction of a lot of the ideologies that surround a basic income. I wonder if you had any thoughts or recommendations or things that resonate with you guys.
We get one more question from a woman. Yes, Annie.
The only thing I thank Margaret Thatcher for in the UK was that she individualised the tax system for husbands and wives, and it's made a tremendous difference. And I believe there's still some countries around the world where this has not yet happened, and I would recommend that this is a very important step to take.
Thank you. All right, so we have 4 questions. Let's give our panelists a chance to answer those questions, and then we'll take another round of questions. Who would like to begin? Letty, would you like to begin?
All the questions together.
Yes, all the questions together.
Yeah, I very briefly thank you.
You don't have to be brief. It's your panel.
Thank you, Philip, for the question. I think, yeah, you described very well that part of the problems I think we're thinking of, because although basic income will be useful or it's meant to be a tool for women to do the cleaning as part of their work, or to have a better position and a better time to have more free time, and that means of course that it increments the time of wealthier women to do some of these activities. There it shows that the interest, the needs, and the impact of basic income is different, because for wealthier women, they are thinking of changing the internal norms of the family structure and the parenting structures, that they might be at some point be also a consideration for more poor women, but at the moment the needs are in a different direction. So that's the something that it needs to be, we think, considered and analyzed, how basic income will be part of the different needs, different requests, and it seems to me that this is quite a part of the ongoing thinking, but it seems to me that a basic income it might have more direct effects in some of these consequences that they are thought of as part of poor people or poor women, but it requires a different type of changes when we are thinking about social structures and particular inside the society, family and norms that cannot be just satisfied with an amount of money, that require a different type of policies. Not sure if I'm answering your question, but I would like to hear more of, yeah.
Really, the suggestion is that in a way, basic income would be worse, would make things worse for richer men, but it would be even worse for richer women. And hence, the idea that there are these internal tensions, vertical tensions would be greater among women than among men.
No,
So,
I totally, I agree, and it shows that it's necessary to take into account these different effects. Thanks.
And perhaps our other panelists
Yeah.
have like comment on that as well.
Okay, can I take the questions in turn?
Sure, and you don't have to answer every single one, but
Yeah.
whatever ones you think. is
Okay,
relevant.
so in terms of the Taiwanese pilot, I think that positionality is at the core of what we're talking about, really. And so I'd invite you to adopt a feminist methodology that's focused on participation, recognition, and visibility. And I'd invite you to work with us with that framework. Have a look and see if that helps. So I would say that participation and that privileging of lived experience is absolutely crucial, because, as you say, single mums is a big category with lots of internal intersectional issues. In terms of vertical tension, I think it's really interesting, and it's been mentioned quite a few times in this conference, of this balance between individualism and solidarity. And I think that that's the difference between a technical intervention and a transformative one, because it's the ability through solidarity for the challenging of existing social forms such as patriarchy that can make it transformative. So as long as it's individualized to this woman and that woman and their differences and putting them in competition or against each other, then those vertical tensions are exacerbated to me. So I would say that I totally understand that it's only because of the gendered role of work and productive and reproductive work that creates that vertical tension between women. And so in order for it to be transformative, there needs to be some challenge to that in itself. In terms of Australia, I don't know anything about Australia. But I do think, for me, the incremental approach is an issue about problematization and categorization. And that's always going to be full of tension. And as Chloe said, about who's included, who's not, how do you prove it, all of those things. And I just refer to my individualism versus solidarity in terms of, I've been really surprised at how little individual taxation I've heard about from different countries, and what huge difference that makes to be treated as an individual, but also to recognise the solidarity and universal basic income. So that's me.
I only have answers to two of them, so I'll start with Taiwan, which covered a lot of what I was going to say, and I'm glad that you clarified what the context was, because I think the context of where you're thinking about a pilot for is what I think it comes down to as being really important in my mind. If you were designing a basic income pilot for single mothers in Canada, I would be saying you really want to be attending to issues of surveillance, because historically single women receiving welfare, especially Black single women in Canada and Indigenous women, have been like highly surveilled in the receipt of welfare. So I'd really be thinking through how you're designing a pilot that really challenges some of those trends. I don't know very much about Taiwan, and you probably know a lot more than me if you're in that role, but I'd be thinking about sort of what the SCEP context is there and how you're building that in. And I think, thinking about, are there ways to be engaging people with, like, engaging single mothers within the development of that pilot, thinking through evaluation. Outside of school, I wear a hat as program evaluator and think a lot about feminist evaluation. And how are you defining outcomes? Are you thinking beyond just workforce participation, and thinking about confidence, self-esteem, engagement in community, connection with friends, connection with family? Like, there are a lot of other things that you can be thinking about that might not typically make their way into the outcomes that you were thinking about in the context of basic income. Collecting disaggregated data, collecting qualitative data. I'm gonna say that a couple more times. But we've got a framework you can use as well. So that was good. And I actually have a lot of thoughts about Australia, and we can chat after if it's helpful. Just to say, I think it sounds like our contexts are quite similar, where we have a federal government who is at least likes to position themselves as very feminist forward, and we have institutionalized in Canada what we call gender-based analysis plus for policy analysis, which is kind of a watered down version of intersectionality, that any public policy at the federal level has to go through this process to be able to be made into law. And whether or not it's done well, I think, and again, there's a whole other question there, but like the mechanisms are in place for that to be built in, and having that external or that public support and some of these mechanisms built into the policymaking process has absolutely opened up space for activists to be able to leverage some of those more gender-based questions within basic income advocacy. And again, in Canada, we are not talking about a UBI, we are talking about something inconsistent. The incremental and like very practical approach is very front of mind, because we do have politicians here on things, and like we are pretty engaged in these conversations. So I'm happy to share some like stuff that we've done with you, but like we've done op-eds. We did a couple of years ago, I worked on with a couple of other folks and organizations, including the ICN, which Ben is part of, a statement that received signatories from like women and feminist organizations across the country that endorsed a basic income. And we had signatories like the YWCA nationally, and like all of the folks who you kind of want their names on that type of thing. We developed a brief where we had sources from people like Almaz that did build drawing on that literature that was presented at the Standing Committee for the Status of Women, that Standing Committee actually took up basic income as a recommendation. I think where that kind of falls is then when you look at the significance or importance or value that the Women and Gender Equality Ministry is afforded compared to employment and social development or health, like it is pretty small in comparison. So like we've got the ears of those people, and we've kind of got some mechanisms in place, but then, you know, the finance minister comes in and it's like that, and then kind of falls flat. But can share some things that we've done if that's helpful. It sounds like we're in a spot. So
Yeah, it sounds like there's a consulting business coming out of this paper on this approach. And I just want to also emphasize what you mentioned about gender budgeting, another term for it, right? The requirements that government policies be analyzed specifically for their differential gender effects is really important, and I think it's something that the UBI movement can also include. I just want to ask again if we have any online questions. If there are any online questions, I guess either raise your hand or unmute. I don't see any, but I do encourage
There's something
that.
written in Korean. I don't know if anybody can read
Is
that.
that a question or?
There are Koreans in the room.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So I think we can take two more questions. You have a question? Yeah.
I have a quick question for Professor Mo랄le's. Yeah. Have we ever thought about using basic services to relieve or differentiate these tensions, particular tensions? I think that, you know, the basic income alone might deepen the class differences among women. But we can use basic services, like, you know, proper public training, generous public health system, etc. So when combined with basic services, basic income might not be so bad for women. That's my suggestion.
Okay. Thanks. And we'll just take one more question, Sarah.
Yeah, I mean, one of the 5 characteristics of basic income, individual, I think we justify for a variety of reasons, particularly in terms of giving individual freedom and also the sense of entitlement. My specific question to Maria and also, but in general, including to Almaz. Now, Maria made this distinction between a European context where, I mean, there's a theoretical possibility of exit from an abusive relationship or an abusive employer. Now, but then Maria complicated the whole thing by saying that in the Indian context, in the work-free project, exit is not really even a theoretical possibility. Now, my question is that what does basic income actually do in a context like that, which is so oppressive and exit is not a possibility? Does that, I mean, this is extreme situations, but then does that give a more negotiating space for women or teens, or what does it do at all? Is that a very closed system, or is there any hope there?
Great, thank you. Let's just, in the interest of time, let's stop there for the questions right now and just again give each of our participants a chance to address those questions. I know there are other questions, but
Sure.
okay, but we'll have to wait.
Thanks, Anne. So yeah, of course, the other basic services as you were mentioning, and I think that is something that has to take into the consideration. And I don't mean to say that basic income is bad for women at all, but it's just I think that we need as part of a big part of the work that has been done with Roy, with Maria, and other new researchers, and that to start looking at the different needs and impacts and the effects that might have, and how we think of basic income in relation with the other basic services, because there are some also things to consider in the design of basic income, especially again, mentioning what I guess is part of the consensus here is that the design of basic income is not neutral, and therefore we need to think what we want the basic income for.
Answer Sarah's lovely question. So I think, I mean, lots of people have drawn attention to this global north, global south, contextual thing, and that's what we're really saying. It's down to the individual, to the specific context, and you need a way of interrogating that context. And I think, we've talked about that. But in terms of this individual collective balance, I think it's really, really important. I think it's really important for that individual payment to address the equality of individual in a society. That everybody has the same amount. Everybody's worthy as by virtue of being a human being, they have the same. And that's the first kind of struggle, really, in such an oppressive environment. So I think that's really, really important. But I also think that the collective is the place for the possibility of social change. So I think that combination of an individual payment, which can create a sense of equal value, alongside the collectivity, because particularly in terms of all kinds of oppression, but particularly taking the gender lens, it's the individualization, the isolation of women from each other and from wider society that limits the possibility for social change. So I think it's really, really important that we open up that space for social change and we allow women's voices to be heard in that space. And I think, in our project, the Plus, is an attempt to do that. And I think empirically we found that certainly women have said to me that the coming together, the creation of that space to come together and share experiences, but also interrogate those experiences in a wider social context is the thing that makes the difference. So I am worthy as an individual, and in conversation with other people, I realise that this is not just my problem, this is everybody's problem. So I think does that answer it?
I wasn't going to say anything, but then your question made me think, well, because I think actually, like, the question of what a basic income does within an oppressive context, I think, like, I don't think that we have an example of basic income that is not within a context of oppression. And I mean, like, we can think about, I'm talking about basic income in Canada in the context of disability. And I teach at a university where I had to move my course for this upcoming fall because wheelchair users couldn't enter the classroom I was assigned. And where disabled people are accessing assisted suicide because they can't afford to survive. Like, I don't think that these are continuums, and we've got better and worse situations that are context dependent, but also everything is bad. And I think there are people who will use the basic income to resist and push up against those systems. And there are people who will use the basic income to survive and get by. And I think we can't expect people to use it to resist. But when the structures and systems are in place for that to be able to happen, like in Work Free, or when you have governments who are actually like doing more active things outside of the context of basic income, that's where I get a little bit of hope. And I think when we get into the, like, people like us are going to get on a panel and be like, basic income doesn't fix oppression, but also like, I think we also don't want to say that it can't, because it can't. And for to expect basic income to fix sexism and ableism and like all of these different things is never going to happen, and then we're not going to move anywhere. So I don't know. That was my little pedestal. I plan on saying, but yeah.
Well, maybe I'll end on a more hopeful note,
Yeah.
which is that in some of the basic income conferences where we've had representatives of domestic violence groups, we have heard, right, that one of the measures of control within abusive relationships is the economic imbalance of power, right? So we know that there's a step before exit, and that is voice, right? So that is the ability to have a little bit more say in the relationship. So hopefully it doesn't have to get necessarily to the exit point in all situations, in all circumstances. So I think we can take some measure of understanding from the idea that in those abusive relationships, one of the measures of control that's used is economic control, to assume that basic income can have some effect on that dynamic, even in situations where it might not be very easy for people to leave completely. All right, well, we are out of time. I know there's additional questions, but yeah, I've been asked to keep it. I've been asked to keep it. No, where's my clock? It's noon. Asked to wrap up.
Mine says 12 noon right now.
Yeah, so let's just end by thanking our presenters again and our wonderful audience as well. Thank you all.
Thank you for attending this session. I have a short announcement. From now until 1 p.m. we are gonna have a lunch time. Oh, I'm really sorry, but it's quite important announcement. From now on until 1 p.m. we are gonna have a lunch time, but unfortunately, all the restaurant and kitchens around here are shut down because the school is having a graduation day today. So we offer a free lunch box today. So if you go down to the basement 4th floor to the hall, we have a plenary session. We have a veggie curry lunch box for everyone, so you can get it in the basement 4th floor and enjoy your lunch in there. And then from 1 p.m. we are gonna have another concurrent session. So please enjoy your veggie curry rice lunch box. And then see everyone again at 1 p.m. Thank you very much.